Mr. and Mrs. Grinling lived with their cat Hamish in a little white cottage perched high on the cliffs. Mr. Grinling was a part-time lighthouse keeper. He shared the work with his assistant, Sam. It was Monday, and Monday was Mr. Grinling's day off. Miss Grinling was bustling about in the kitchen, and Mr. Grinling was getting in the way. Well, Mrs. Grinling thought he was getting in the way. Mr. Grinling thought he was quietly eating his toast. "Please eat faster, Mr. G," said Mrs. Grinling. "It's only 3 weeks until Sam's wedding, and I haven't done any of the cooking." "Oh, yummy," said Mr. Grinling. "I'll help." "No, thank you," said Mrs. Grinling. "You're a lovely man, Mr. G, but a dreadful cook. You're much better at eating. Why don't you go and look for a mermaid instead?" That's what's called a private joke. Mr. Grinling had always hoped one day he might see a mermaid combing her golden hair. There's nothing very unusual about that. Lots of people would like to see a mermaid. When Mr. Grinling got in her way, Mrs. Grinling often sent him to look for mermaids. Meanwhile, something unusual was happening down in Wild Horses Bay. A small golden shape was climbing out of the sea. "What's that?" Sam saw it first. He was cleaning the lighthouse and dreaming of Sally de la Croissant. In 3 weeks' time, they would hold their wedding at the lighthouse, so it needed to be spick and span. As he checked for ships and boats through his telescope, he spied the small, golden, rather hairy thing on the rock. Funny color for a seal, he thought. Mr. Grinling saw it, but not until later. He had decided to go surfing. As he walked down to Wild Horses Bay, he was thinking about the wedding too. He was to be the best man, which meant he had to wear a suit. He hated wearing suits. He wished that Sam and Sally would just sail away in a beautiful pea-green boat and forget about having a wedding. Mrs. Grinling didn't see the small hairy thing. She was making a list of the wedding food, so she didn't have time to look outside. It was while he was waiting for a big wave that Mr. Grinling saw it. The sun glinted on the golden hair. Mr. Grinling crossed his fingers. Maybe, at last, he would see a mermaid. He paddled towards the rock, but the closer he got, the more disappointed he became. The creature was golden and hairy, but not like a mermaid. "Next time," said Mr. Grinling. "Perhaps next time it just might be a mermaid." The small, golden, hairy thing lifted its head. "Woof!" it said quietly. "That's definitely not a mermaid," sighed Mr. Grinling. "Perhaps it's a Merdog. You can't stay on this rock, little dog. It will be underwater when the tide comes in." He put the dog on the surfboard and paddled for the beach. The little dog flopped onto the sand. "Time for you to go home now," said Mr. Grinling. "Home." But the dog just gazed up at him with large, sad eyes. "You must have a home," said Mr. Grinling. "Most of us have homes somewhere. I can't take you to mine because Miss G doesn't like dogs. She particularly doesn't like small, hairy, and very smelly dogs. You do, Pong. Now please, go home." Mr. Grinling gave the little dog a pat and set off for his cottage. Meanwhile, Sam was looking through his telescope again. He noticed that as Mr. Grinling walked up the path, the small golden thing followed behind, just out of sight. "Of course," he said to himself, "it's a dog. That spells Trouble with Miss G and Hamish." It was lunchtime in the little white cottage. Mr. Grinling was eating fish pie, and Mrs. Grinling was still bustling about. She stopped. I can hear something sniffing, Mr. G. Phew! What a pong! It's a small, golden, hairy thing. I rescued him from the rock, exclaimed Mr. Grinling. I did tell him to go home. Well, he can't have a home here, said Mrs. Grinling. Go away, dog. Go away! But the little dog was so tired he'd fallen asleep. Mr. Grinling gathered him up and put him in Hamish's old basket. Hamish won't like this either, said Mrs. Grinling. That dog must go. Mr. Grinling sighed. He rather liked the sad little dog. Hamish did not like the little dog. He arched his orange back and spat, but the little dog took no notice. He wasn't frightened of cats. That dog cannot stay here, said Mrs. Grinling over and over, at least 10 times that afternoon. Goodbye, little dog. Miss G will be very pleased. Go on, little dog. Off you go. Mrs. Grinling put up a large notice in Lighthouse Bay shop, but nobody came to collect the dog. That should do it. I'll go as fast as I can. Puff, puff. He's back again. Ugh, said Mr. Grinling. Woof, woof, barked the dog. It was Thursday and breakfast time again. There was a lot of barking and squawking in the garden. Mrs. Grinling smiled. The only thing that dog is good for is chasing seagulls. I don't like him, Mr. G, but it looks as though he's here to stay. And there are 3 conditions. Number 1, you give him a bath so he doesn't pong. Number 2, he does not come into the kitchen. Number 3, you encourage him to chase those seagulls. The dog wagged his tail. Mr. Grinling would have wagged his too if he had one. Instead, he hugged the dog and Mrs. Grinling and announced that from now on, the dog would be called Merdog. I found him on a rock, he explained to everyone who asked. He might have come from the sea. Mr. Grinling and Murtagh became good friends. Mrs. Grinling and Murtagh did not become good friends. Murtagh did not understand the bathing a bit. He loved being dirty. You pong. Murtagh did not understand the kitchen rule either. He thought that if humans came into kitchens and ate off tables, then dogs should too. Out, out. That dog, muttered Mrs. Grinling darkly as she chased him out. Murtagh did understand about chasing seagulls. He chased them whenever they flew into the garden. He also tried chasing Hamish, but the sharp tap on the nose soon fixed that. Murtagh followed Mr. Grinling everywhere. He thought that Mr. Grinling was the bee's knees. It was Monday again, and Sam was looking through his telescope. He observed Mr. Grinling on his surfboard with a small, golden, hairy thing. Well, I never, said Sam to himself. That dog is surfing. And because he liked talking to himself, he added, perhaps it really is a Merdog. Perhaps it did just come from the sea. And now there's another bit to the story. Far away in a town, Louis, aged 8, cried himself to sleep again. He had lost a very good friend. His mother and father had looked everywhere for his friend, but he had vanished. Louis had cried himself to sleep for 9 nights. It was Monday again, and only 5 days to the wedding. Mrs. Grinling was extremely busy. The freezer was full of food, but there was still more cooking to do. Again, it was Mr. Grinling's day off, and again he was in Mrs. Grinling's way. Please, Mr. G, she said, go and find a mermaid for Merdog. I am so busy, I can't think straight. Oh, no, she wailed. I've run out of butter, and the Lighthouse Bay shop is closed today." "Then Merdog and I will cycle to Wild Horse's Bay store," said Mr. Grinling. But there was a surprise waiting when Mr. Grinling and Merdog puffed into the village. There, in the shop window, was a large poster. "Bob, our golden dog, is missing. Maybe he has run away to the sea. Our son Louis is heartbroken. If you find him, please ring 0775757558881. What a nasty surprise for Mr. Grinling. Merdog couldn't stay with him. He belonged to Louis, who was very upset. "We'll run away together," whispered Mr. Grinling to Merdog. "We'll hide in the woods." He cycled down the street, but he didn't go far. He didn't even reach the first tree. He couldn't keep Merdog when Louis was so unhappy. He cycled back up to the street again. The shopkeeper was outside the door. "You've found Bob, then," he said. "He's always running away. He doesn't like living in the town, you see, so whenever the Loppets return home after their holiday, Bob vanishes." Bob barked when he heard his name. "I'll really miss him," sighed Mr. Grinling. "We're good friends. I rescued him from a rock, you know. I've taught him to surf. He's a real sea dog." So he wrote down Louis's telephone number, and he and Merdog, called Bob, cycled for home. Every now and then he would pat Merdog in the basket behind. This was not a good idea when on a bicycle. "Don't rock the boat, Merdog." It was also not a good idea for a dog to leap up and down in a bike basket. As they cycled down the hill, the bike wobbled and tipped, and Mr. Grinling went sprawling across the road. "I can't move my leg," he groaned. Merdog sat beside him. He licked Mr. Grinling's face as if to say, "Don't worry, I'll look after you." 3 seagulls hovered above the accident. "We'd better fetch Mrs. Grinling." That wasn't one of our better ideas. "Don't be silly, she'll just shoo us away. We have to get that dog to chase us." At first, Merdog tried to ignore the seagulls. He wanted to look after Mr. Grinling, but he was a dog, after all. Bit by bit, the seagulls tempted him to follow them. He chased them all the way to the little white cottage where Mrs. Grinling was waiting for the butter. "He's coming! Woof, woof! Where's Mr. G?" "Well done, Merdog!" "Is that you, Mr. G?" "Mr. G," cried Mrs. Grinling, "you foolish man, what have you done?" It's my leg." Now things happened very quickly. The helicopter rescued Mr. Grinling and took him to the hospital with Mrs. Grinling and the Merdog. Somehow the newspaper heard about the rescue, so Merdog had his photo in the paper. Even Mrs. Grinling agreed that Merdog was the hero. The next day, Mr. Grinling came home again with his leg in plaster. Then it was Saturday, and that meant the wedding. The sun was shining as it always does in the best stories. Mr. Grinling, the hop-along best man, was dressed in his lighthouse clothes. His broken leg wouldn't fit into the suit. On a boat just out from the lighthouse, an 8-year-old boy called Louis looked through a telescope. Yes, Mr. Grinling had remembered to ring him. "I can see my dog!" shouted Louis. "Bob! Bob!" "Merdog! Merdog!" cried Mr. Grinling. What confusion! There's a bride and a groom who have just been married, lots of guests who are hungry, and a small hairy dog swimming backwards and forwards between 2 people he loves. At last it was all sorted out. Sally invited Louis and his mom and dad to the wedding so Bob, or Merdog, could be with his best friends. Mr. Grinling and Louis decided they could share the little dog. This was very hard for Louis, but he knew that Bob hated living in the town. He was a sea dog through and through. Bob stays with Louis in his holiday house at the weekends, and Mr. Grinling looks after Merdog during the week. 2 dog names, but the little golden dog is very happy. Mrs. Grinling had become quite fond of Murdog, but Hamish was still cross. "That dog," hissed Hamish. "Do calm down, Hamish. Go and eat your fish pie," barked Murdog. Thanks for joining us for story time. We hope you enjoyed the activity. For more programs and information about the Jupiter Inlet Lighthouse and Museum, follow our website, www.jupiterlighthouse.org.